What would you do if you discovered that the person your child loves most isn't you? Picture this. A crystal wine glass crashes to the marble floor of a Manhattan penthouse. Red wine spreads like blood across pristine white stone. And through a bedroom door, a millionaire father hears 3 words that will destroy everything he thought he knew about his own family. "Mama, don't leave me." But here's the twist that will make your heart stop. The woman his 5-year-old son is calling Mama isn't his wife. His wife died 3 years ago. The woman in that room, the woman who has somehow stolen his child's heart, is Mara Elon, the nanny. Tonight, you're about to witness the most shocking family drama of the year. A story where a single slap will trigger a chain reaction so devastating, it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and what it really means to be a parent. This is the story of Elric Van Loft, a man who had everything money could buy, but lost the one thing that money can't purchase: his son's love. And the incredible woman who showed him that the most powerful apology isn't found in words, but in the courage to completely transform who you are. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we get to the shocking moment when this powerful millionaire loses control and strikes the woman who loves his child, before we witness his own fiancée slap him back in front of Manhattan's elite, before we see a 5-year-old boy's world collapse in a single evening, we need to understand how a father became a stranger in his own child's life, how love grew in the spaces where attention should have been, and how 3 broken people found each other in the most unexpected way possible. Are you ready for a story that will make you question what family really means? A tale that proves love doesn't always follow the rules we think it should? Then settle in, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about parenthood, sacrifice, and the incredible power of second chances forever. This is a story about the night a millionaire learned that you can't buy love, but you can destroy it with a single moment of unforgivable cruelty. Elric Van Loft lived 47 floors above the streets of Manhattan, but he had never felt further from Earth. At 38 years old, he commanded an empire worth $200 million. His company, Van Loft Properties, had reshaped the city skyline with glass and steel monuments to ambition and success. Every morning at 5 a.m., he stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse bedroom, coffee in hand, surveying his kingdom like a modern-day pharaoh. The city stretched before him in all directions, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, all of them smaller and less significant than his own carefully constructed existence. But empires built on ambition require constant feeding, and Elric had fed his with pieces of his soul he didn't even realize he was losing. The penthouse itself was a masterpiece of interior design, 10,000 square feet of marble, mahogany, and modern art that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Everything was precisely placed, carefully curated, expensive beyond the dreams of ordinary people. It was the kind of home that made visitors feel both impressed and slightly intimidated, which was exactly the effect Elric intended. What the magazines couldn't capture, what the perfectly staged photographs couldn't convey, was the devastating silence that filled those beautiful rooms. The echo of footsteps on marble floors, the hollow sound of one person moving through spaces designed for a family that had been shattered by tragedy and neglect. 3 years ago, this had been a different kind of home. 3 years ago, Sarah Van Loft had filled these rooms with laughter and warmth and the particular kind of chaos that comes from really living in a space rather than just occupying it. She had been Elric's college sweetheart, the one person who remembered him before he became successful, who loved him for reasons that had nothing to do with his bank account or social status. Sarah had been a teacher, kindergarten, with a gift for seeing the potential in every child who walked into her classroom. She could calm tantrums with quiet words, inspire shy children to speak up, and make learning feel like the adventure it was supposed to be. She had brought those same gifts to their marriage, seeing past Elric's driven exterior to the uncertain boy underneath who was constantly trying to prove he was worthy of love. When Bram was born, Sarah had transformed again, becoming the kind of mother who made it look effortless even when it was anything but. She read stories with different voices for every character. She turned bath time into adventures involving pirates and underwater kingdoms. She made ordinary Tuesday afternoons feel magical with nothing more than her attention and imagination. But cancer doesn't care about love or potential or the lives that depend on your presence. It had taken Sarah in 6 brutal months, stealing her away piece by piece until the vibrant woman who had been the heart of their family became a ghost haunting hospital corridors and medical consultations. Elric had fought it the way he fought everything, with money and determination and the absolute conviction that there had to be a solution if he just worked hard enough to find it. He flew Sarah to specialists in 3 different countries. He funded experimental treatments and enrolled her in cutting-edge clinical trials. He transformed their penthouse into a medical facility with private nurses and equipment that cost more than most people's houses. None of it mattered. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in February, holding Elric's hand and whispering instructions about how to take care of their 2-year-old son. Her last coherent words were about Bram's favorite bedtime story and how he liked his grilled cheese sandwiches cut diagonally, never in squares. "Promise me," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical breathing that had been keeping her alive for the past week. "Promise me you'll be enough for both of us." Elric had promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. But promises made in hospital rooms don't come with instruction manuals, and grief doesn't follow the same rules as business success. In the weeks and months that followed Sarah's death, Elric had thrown himself into work with a desperate intensity that impressed his colleagues and worried his friends. He expanded operations into 3 new markets. He closed deals that had been languishing for years. He worked 18-hour days and slept in his office more often than his own bed. He told himself he was securing Bram's future, building a legacy worthy of Sarah's memory. He convinced himself that providing financial security was the most important gift he could give his son. He rationalized his absence by pointing to the trust funds and education accounts and investment portfolios that grew larger with each successful deal. But while Elric was building his empire, his son was learning to live without him. Bram Van Loft was 5 years old and already an expert at being alone. Not physically alone. The penthouse was always filled with housekeepers and tutors and various staff members hired to meet his every need. But emotionally alone, in the way that only children of absent parents truly understand. He had his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin, along with a vocabulary that impressed adults and a maturity that should have concerned them. He could discuss architecture with his father's business associates, knew the names of at least 6 different types of marble, and understood that Daddy has an important meeting was code for "you'll be eating dinner by yourself again tonight." His daily routine was structured with the precision of a military operation. Wake up at 7 a.m. when Maria, the morning housekeeper, opened his curtains and laid out his clothes. Breakfast at 7:30, always the same. Whole grain cereal with sliced banana and orange juice that had been freshly squeezed by someone whose name he didn't know. Educational programming on the tablet, while Maria tidied his room and prepared his school bag. School from 8:30 to 3 o'clock, where he excelled academically but struggled socially. The other children found him too serious, too formal, too much like a small adult rather than a playmate. Teachers praised his intelligence and work ethic while privately worrying about his tendency to play alone and his reluctance to participate in group activities. After school, there was homework supervised by Mrs. Chun, his academic tutor. Then piano lessons with Mr. Rodriguez on Mondays and Wednesdays, swimming with Coach Patterson on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and art therapy with Dr. Williams on Fridays. An appointment Elric had insisted on after Bram's kindergarten teacher mentioned that he seemed emotionally withdrawn. Dinner time was usually shared with whatever staff member was responsible for his care that evening, eaten in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room that was reserved for his father's business dinners. Bram had learned not to ask when Daddy would be home because the answer was always the same. "Daddy's working very hard to take care of you, sweetheart. He'll see you soon." Bath time, supervised toothbrushing, and bedtime stories read by whichever adult was available. And then, in the darkness of his bedroom, Bram would lie awake listening to the sounds of the city below and the even lonelier sounds of the empty penthouse around him. He had stopped asking for his mother after the first year, not because he had forgotten her, but because he had learned that missing someone out loud made the adults around him sad and uncomfortable. Instead, he kept his memories private. The way she smelled like vanilla and lavender, the songs she used to sing while giving him baths, the funny voices she made when reading his favorite books. Sometimes, late at night, he would whisper to her picture on his nightstand, telling her about his day and asking questions he knew she couldn't answer. Mama, why doesn't Daddy want to play with me? Mama, did I do something wrong? Mama, when will Daddy love me the way he loved you? The worst part wasn't the loneliness. Children are remarkably adaptable, and Bram had learned to find comfort in routines and solitary activities. The worst part was the hope that flared up every time he heard his father's key in the lock, every time Elric's schedule allowed for an unexpected early arrival home. Daddy, Bram would call out, running to the foyer with excitement that broke the hearts of every staff member who witnessed it. You're home. Can we play? Can we read a story? Can we watch a movie? And Elric would scoop him up, hold him close, promise that they would spend time together later or this weekend or as soon as this big project is finished. He would ruffle Bram's hair and ask about school and make all the right parental noises while mentally reviewing his schedule and calculating how many hours he could afford to spare before the next crisis demanded his attention. Sometimes they did manage to spend time together. Awkward, stilted attempts at father-son bonding that felt forced and artificial to both of them. Elric would take Bram to expensive restaurants where they sat across from each other, making polite conversation about kindergarten curriculum and building projects. They would go to Broadway shows where Elric spent most of the time answering emails on his phone. They would visit museums and parks and all the places that good fathers were supposed to take their children, but somehow never managed to connect in the way that mattered most. The problem wasn't that Elric didn't love his son. The problem was that he had forgotten how to show love in ways that didn't involve money or achievements or providing for future needs. He had convinced himself that being a good father meant ensuring Bram's financial security and educational opportunities, not realizing that what his son needed most was simply his presence and attention. So Bram learned to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he received. He learned to treasure the rare moments when his father seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts and feelings. And he learned not to expect too much, because disappointment was harder to bear than resignation. By the time he was 5, Bram had developed coping mechanisms that would have impressed child psychologists and worried anyone who understood the cost of such premature emotional self-sufficiency. He could entertain himself for hours with books and building blocks. He could eat meals alone without complaint. He could go to sleep without bedtime stories when the adults were too busy to provide them. Most importantly, he had learned to be very, very good, because being good meant not causing problems, and not causing problems meant that maybe, possibly, his father might have time for him. But even the most patient child has limits. And even the most understanding 5-year-old eventually needs someone to love him the way his mother had, completely, unconditionally, with the kind of attention that makes a child feel like the most important person in the world. Bram didn't know it yet, but that someone was about to walk into his life and change everything. Mara Elon arrived at the Van Loft penthouse on a gray October morning, carrying a single suitcase and references that didn't tell the whole story of who she was or why she had chosen to spend her life caring for other people's children. She was 35 years old, though there were moments when something in her eyes made her seem both younger and infinitely older. She spoke with a trace of a southern accent that hinted at roots far from Manhattan steel and glass, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked with more than just words and theories. The employment agency had described her as highly qualified but unconventional, a euphemism that usually meant trouble, but in Mara's case meant something more complex. She had a master's degree in early childhood education from Vanderbilt University, 5 years of experience as a kindergarten teacher, and recommendations that praised her intuitive understanding of children's emotional needs. But there were gaps in her employment history that she deflected with vague references to family obligations and personal circumstances that required a career change. What the agency didn't know, what even Elric's background check hadn't uncovered, was that Mara Elon had once been Mara Thompson, beloved kindergarten teacher at Magnolia Elementary School in Nashville, Tennessee. The woman who could calm any tantrum with a gentle word, who made learning feel like magic, who had a gift for seeing the potential in every child who walked into her classroom. That woman had disappeared 3 years ago, on the same rainy Tuesday when her 3-year-old son Marcus had been killed in a car accident that still visited her dreams every night. She had been driving. They were on their way to the grocery store, singing along to his favorite songs, when the truck ran the red light. The impact had been swift and brutal, the kind of accident that traffic reporters describe as unsurvivable without understanding that some people do survive them, physically intact but fundamentally broken. Marcus had died instantly. Mara had walked away with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a grief so profound it felt like drowning while still being expected to breathe. The months that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements and insurance claims and well-meaning friends who said things like, "At least he didn't suffer, and God needed another angel in heaven." Mara had nodded and smiled and accepted casseroles from neighbors, while secretly wondering how anyone could believe that a loving God would steal a child from his mother's arms. She had tried to return to teaching, try to find comfort in the routine of lesson plans and story time and the bright faces of other people's children. But every child reminded her of Marcus. Every laugh echoed with his voice. Every scraped knee and tearful moment made her want to gather them all in her arms and promise them that nothing bad would ever happen, even though she knew such promises were lies. The principal had been understanding when she requested a leave of absence. The school board had been patient when that leave extended from weeks to months. But eventually, everyone had to accept the truth. Mara Thompson, the teacher who had once made magic happen in her classroom, was too broken to continue teaching. So she had reinvented herself as Mara Elon, taking her grandmother's maiden name and moving north to a city where nobody knew her story. She became a nanny because caring for children one-on-one felt manageable in ways that managing a classroom no longer did. She could pour her maternal instincts into a single child without the overwhelming reminder of everything she had lost. The family she worked for saw her as professional, competent, mysteriously skilled at managing their children's emotional needs. They didn't know that she spent her evenings in her small rented rooms, holding a white cotton handkerchief embroidered with a letter, the only thing of Marcus's that she had been able to keep close without falling apart. When the Van Loft agency called about the position with Elric Van Loft, Mara had almost declined. A grieving widower and his young son felt too close to her own story, too likely to reopen wounds that were barely healed. But she needed the work, and something in the description of 5-year-old Bram's situation made her think that maybe this family needed someone who understood loss in ways that went beyond professional training. She was right, though not in the way she expected. Meeting Bram for the first time was like being struck by lightning. Not because he looked like Marcus, they were different in every physical way, but because she recognized something in his careful politeness, his premature maturity, his way of taking up as little space as possible in his own home. "Hello, Miss Mara," he said when Elric introduced them, shaking her hand with the formal courtesy of a miniature adult. "Daddy says you're going to take care of me now." The phrase, "take care of me now," carried weight that made Mara's heart ache. Here was a child who had already learned that the adults in his life were temporary, that care was something provided by employees rather than parents, that love was a luxury he couldn't expect but should be grateful to receive in whatever form it came. During the interview, while Elric asked questions about her qualifications and experience, Mara found herself watching Bram. He sat quietly in the corner of the living room, building something elaborate with Lego blocks, occasionally glancing up at the adults with the careful attention of someone trying to gauge whether this new person would be kind or just another in a series of temporary caretakers. When Elric stepped out to take a phone call, an interruption that clearly frustrated him, but which he couldn't ignore, Mara saw her opening. "What are you building?" she asked, kneeling down beside Bram's construction project. "It's a house," he said, not looking up from his work. But not like this house. A smaller house. A house where families live together. The unconscious indictment in his words was heartbreaking. What makes a house a family house? Mara asked gently. Bram considered this seriously. I think it's when people eat dinner together and read stories, and when someone tucks you in every night. Not just sometimes. Every night. That sounds nice, Mara said. Are you going to put people in your family house? Maybe, Bram said, finally looking up at her. Do you think families can be different than just mommies and daddies and kids? The question was asked with the innocence of a child who was already trying to figure out how to create connection in a world that felt fundamentally disconnected. I think families can be anyone who loves each other and takes care of each other, Mara said. Sometimes that's mommies and daddies and kids. Sometimes it's different people who choose to be together because they make each other happy. Bram nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. I think I like that kind of family, he said quietly. When Elric returned, apologizing for the interruption and asking where they had left off in the interview, he found Mara and Bram sitting together on the floor, collaborating on the Lego house, and talking quietly about the kinds of rooms that families needed. I see you've met our architect, Elric said with a smile that was genuine for the first time since Mara had arrived. He's very talented, Mara replied, helping Bram attach a roof to their creation, and very wise about what makes a home special. Something in her tone, something in the way she looked at his son with real attention rather than professional courtesy, made Elric's decision for him. When can you start? He asked. Mara looked at Bram, who was watching her hopefully, and felt something shift in her chest. Not healing exactly, but the possibility of it. Tomorrow, she said. I can start tomorrow. Neither she nor Elric could have predicted how completely that decision would change all of their lives. Neither of them understood that bringing Mara Elon into the Van Loft household wasn't just hiring a nanny. It was introducing a catalyst that would transform their carefully ordered dysfunction into something messier, more complex, and ultimately more real than anything they had experienced before. But change, even positive change, rarely comes without cost. And the price for the love and healing that Mara would bring to their family would be higher than any of them could have imagined. Mara's first week in the Van Loft penthouse passed like a careful ballet between three people learning new steps. She moved through the marble halls and perfect rooms like a warm breeze through a museum, bringing life to spaces that had been beautiful but sterile for too long. Her approach to caring for Bram was unlike anything the household had seen before. Previous nannies had been efficient, professional, focused on schedules and educational enrichment. They had treated Bram with the kind of pleasant competence usually reserved for small businesses rather than small people. Mara treated him like he was the most fascinating person she had ever met. Tell me about your day, she would say when picking him up from school. Not the perfunctory question adults usually ask children, but with genuine curiosity about his thoughts and experiences. She would listen to his answers with the focused attention usually reserved for matters of international importance, asking follow-up questions that showed she was actually processing what he said rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. When Bram told her about the argument he'd witnessed between two classmates over a toy truck, Mara didn't offer quick advice or dismiss it as typical childhood drama. Instead, she asked how it made him feel to watch his friends fight, whether he thought there might have been a way to help them solve the problem, and what he would want someone to do if he were sad or angry. You have a very kind heart, she told him after one such conversation. You notice when other people are hurting, and you want to help them feel better. That's a special gift. Bram glowed under this kind of attention in ways that broke Mara's heart and healed it simultaneously. Here was a child starving for meaningful connection, and every small gesture of genuine interest felt like water to someone dying of thirst. The changes began subtly. Bram started talking more at meals, sharing observations about his day, and asking questions about Mara's experiences. He began seeking her out when he had problems to solve or ideas to share, treating her not as an employee, but as a trusted adult who valued his thoughts and feelings. Mara, he said one afternoon while they worked on homework together. Why do some kids have mommies and daddies who pick them up from school, but other kids have people like you? The question was asked without self-pity, just genuine curiosity about the different ways families could be structured. Well, Mara said carefully, setting aside the math worksheet they had been working on, every family is different. Some kids live with their mommies and daddies. Some kids live with just one parent, or with grandparents, or with other people who love them very much. What matters isn't who takes care of you, but that whoever does it loves you and makes you feel safe. Do you love me? The question was asked with the directness that only children possess, without embarrassment or artifice. Mara felt her breath catch. In her previous positions, such questions had been easily deflected with professional boundaries and appropriate responses about caring for all children in her charge. But looking at Bram's earnest face, she found herself incapable of anything but complete honesty. Yes, she said simply, I do love you. Very much. The smile that spread across Bram's face was like sunrise after a long night. I love you too, he said with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone stating an obvious truth. You make me feel happy inside. That evening, as Mara helped Bram with his bath and bedtime routine, she found herself settling into rhythms that felt both new and achingly familiar. The way she tested the water temperature with her elbow, the gentle efficiency with which she shampooed his hair, the patient untangling of knots without pulling or causing discomfort. All of it brought back memories of Marcus's bath times, but without the devastating pain she had expected. Instead, there was something healing in caring for Bram, in channeling her maternal instincts towards someone who needed them so desperately. It wasn't replacing Marcus. Nothing could ever do that, but it was finding a way to honor his memory by loving another child who deserved all the tenderness she had to give. Mara, Bram said as she helped him into his pajamas, will you read me a story tonight? Of course, sweetheart. What would you like to hear? The one about the little prince and the rose, he said, climbing into bed with the stuffed elephant that had been his comfort object since his mother's death. Daddy used to read it to me sometimes, but he doesn't have time anymore. The casual mention of his father's absence was delivered without reproach, just the resigned acceptance of a child who had learned not to expect too much. Mara felt a flash of anger at Elric's priorities, but pushed it aside. Her job wasn't to judge his parenting choices, but to provide Bram with the care and attention he needed. She settled into the chair beside his bed and opened the worn copy of The Little Prince that she found on his nightstand. As she read, using different voices for the various characters, and pausing to answer Bram's questions about the story's meaning, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The pure joy of sharing literature with a child who was genuinely engaged with the narrative. Why did the little prince love the rose so much when she was vain and difficult? Bram asked during one of their pauses. What do you think? Mara asked, recognizing a teachable moment when she saw one. Bram considered this seriously, chewing on his lower lip the way he did when wrestling with complex ideas. I think maybe because love isn't about whether someone is perfect. Maybe it's about choosing to care about them, even when they're not easy to care about. The insight was so mature, so thoughtful, that Mara felt tears spring to her eyes. That's exactly right, she said softly. Love is a choice we make every day, not just when it's convenient or easy. Is that why you love me even when I make mistakes? Bram asked. That's exactly why, Mara confirmed. Love means I care about you whether you're perfect or not, whether you're having a good day or a difficult one. It means you're safe with me no matter what. As Bram drifted off to sleep, still clutching his elephant and murmuring sleepy observations about princes and roses and the nature of love, Mara found herself experiencing something she had thought was lost forever. The profound satisfaction of nurturing a child's emotional and intellectual development. But she was also acutely aware that she was falling in love with a child who wasn't hers, in a situation that was inherently temporary and potentially problematic. Professional boundaries existed for good reasons, and she was walking dangerously close to crossing lines that could hurt everyone involved. The problem was that Bram needed more than professional care. He needed love, attention, and the kind of emotional investment that couldn't be maintained within the safe limits of employee-employer relationships. And Mara, despite her best intentions to remain appropriately detached, found herself unable to withhold the love that Bram so desperately needed and deserved. Late that night, sitting in her small room with Marcus's handkerchief in her hands, Mara made a decision that would change everything. She would love Bram completely, unconditionally, and deal with the consequences when they inevitably arose. She had no idea how quickly those consequences would materialize or how devastating they would be for everyone involved. 3 weeks after Mara's arrival, Elric began to notice changes in his son that he couldn't ignore, no matter how absorbed he was in his work. Bram was different, more animated at breakfast, more talkative during their brief encounters, more likely to seek out his father's attention rather than simply accepting its absence. "Daddy, guess what I learned today?" became a common greeting when Elric managed to arrive home before bedtime. Instead of the polite, careful conversation that had characterized their interactions for months, Bram began sharing genuine enthusiasm about his experiences at school, his discoveries about the world, his thoughts about everything from why birds could fly to whether buildings had feelings. The change was remarkable, and Elric found himself both grateful for his son's increased happiness and vaguely unsettled by its source. He had hired Mara to provide competent childcare, not to transform his son's entire demeanor and outlook on life. "She's very good with him," Mrs. Chun, Bram's tutor, mentioned during one of their weekly check-ins. "His attention span has improved dramatically, and he's much more engaged with his studies. Whatever Miss Mara is doing is clearly working." Similar reports came from Bram's teachers, his swimming coach, even the doorman who had noticed that the boy seemed brighter somehow, like someone turned on a light inside him. Everyone who interacted with Bram commented on the positive changes in his behavior and attitude. Elric should have been pleased. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he hired a nanny, someone who could provide the kind of care and attention that would help his son thrive. But instead of satisfaction, he felt something more complex and uncomfortable, a growing awareness that someone else was succeeding at parenting his child in ways that he had not. The realization hit him fully one evening in early November when he arrived home unexpectedly early due to a canceled dinner meeting. He had planned to surprise Bram with a rare weeknight story and perhaps make up for some of the bedtimes he had missed recently. But as he climbed the stairs toward Bram's room, he heard voices coming from the kitchen, his son's bright chatter mixed with Mara's warm laughter. Following the sound, he found them baking cookies together, flour dusting every surface, and both of them wearing matching aprons that he was certain he had never purchased. "Careful with the mixer, sweetheart," Mara was saying, her hands guiding Bram's smaller ones as they operated the electric beaters. "We want to blend the ingredients, not spray them all over the kitchen." "Like this?" Bram asked, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "Perfect. You're becoming quite the chef." "Mara, why do cookies taste better when you make them yourself instead of buying them from the store?" "What do you think?" she replied, and Elric recognized the teaching technique she seemed to favor, answering questions with questions that encouraged Bram to think through problems himself. "I think maybe because when you make something with your own hands, you put love into it," Bram said seriously. "And love makes everything taste better." "That's exactly right," Mara said, ruffling his hair with a flour-dusted hand. "You're very wise for someone who's only 5 years old." Elric stood in the doorway, watching this domestic scene unfold, and felt like an intruder in his own home. The easy affection between Mara and Bram, the natural way they moved around each other in the kitchen, the obvious joy they both took in this simple activity, all of it highlighted how artificial and strained his own interactions with his son had become. When had Bram learned to bake? When had he developed opinions about homemade versus store-bought cookies? When had he become the kind of child who could articulate complex thoughts about love and effort and the difference they made in everyday activities? "Daddy," Bram spotted him in the doorway, and his face lit up with surprised delight. "You're home. We're making cookies for Mrs. Patterson because she seemed sad yesterday." "Want to help?" Mrs. Patterson, Elric realized with a start, was their elderly neighbor, a woman he passed in the hallway regularly but had never really noticed beyond polite nods and generic pleasantries. But somehow Bram had not only noticed her emotional state, but taken action to address it, with Mara's encouragement and guidance. "I'd love to help," Elric said, accepting the apron that Mara offered him. "But I have to warn you, I'm not much of a baker." "That's okay," Bram said with the generous patience of someone secure in his own competence. "Mara can teach you. She's really good at teaching people things." What followed was perhaps the most genuinely enjoyable hour Elric had spent with his son in months. They measured ingredients and took turns mixing, debated the optimal number of chocolate chips per cookie, and laughed about the mess they were making. For once, Elric's phone remained silent, and he found himself fully present in the moment instead of mentally reviewing his schedule or planning his next business move. But more than that, he began to understand the difference between spending time with his son and truly connecting with him. Mara had created an environment where Bram felt comfortable expressing himself, asking questions, and engaging with the world around him in ways that went beyond simple compliance or entertainment. "Mara says that cooking is like science," Bram explained as they waited for the cookies to bake. "You have to measure things carefully and follow the steps in order, but you can also experiment and try new things to see what happens." "Is that right?" Elric looked at Mara, who was cleaning up their baking aftermath with efficient grace. "I find that children learn better when they can connect new concepts to things they already understand," she said. "Bram loves to build with Legos, so we talk about recipes like instruction manuals. He's curious about how things work, so we explore the science behind everyday activities." The casual way she discussed his son's learning style and interests revealed how much attention she had been paying to Bram's individual needs and preferences. Elric realized with uncomfortable clarity that he couldn't have provided such detailed insights into his own child's personality and educational requirements. When the cookies were finished baking and they had delivered a plate to Mrs. Patterson, who invited them in for tea and regaled them with stories about her late husband's military service, Elric found himself seeing his son through new eyes. Bram was thoughtful and empathetic, curious about other people's experiences, comfortable with adults in ways that suggested genuine social confidence rather than mere politeness. Walking back to their penthouse, Bram between them, swinging their hands like a bridge connecting two islands, Elric experienced something he hadn't felt in years: pure, uncomplicated happiness in his role as a father. "This was fun," Bram announced to the universe. "Can we do this again tomorrow?" "We'll see," Elric said automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, yes. Let's plan to do something together tomorrow, too." The promise was made impulsively, without consulting his schedule or considering the meetings that would need to be rearranged. But looking at his son's delighted face, Elric realized that for the first time in months, he actually wanted to keep a commitment to his family more than he wanted to pursue his business obligations. That night, after Bram was asleep and Mara had retired to her room, Elric sat in his study trying to process the evening's revelations. His son was thriving under Mara's care in ways that went far beyond basic childcare. She wasn't just supervising him. She was actively nurturing his intellectual and emotional development, creating opportunities for learning and connection that enriched his daily experience. The realization should have made Elric grateful. Instead, it made him acutely aware of his own deficiencies as a parent and the ways in which his absence had created space for someone else to fulfill the role he should have been playing. For the first time since hiring Mara, Elric began to question whether bringing her into their lives had been entirely positive. Yes, Bram was happier and more engaged than he had been in months, but he was also forming an attachment to someone who was, ultimately, an employee, someone whose presence in their lives was contingent on Elric's continued satisfaction with her performance. What would happen when Bram started school full-time and no longer needed a nanny? What would happen if Mara decided to take another position, or if Elric's circumstances changed in ways that made her employment impractical? How do you explain to a child that the person who has become central to his emotional well-being is not actually a permanent part of his family? These questions kept Elric awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to manage a situation that had become far more complex than he had anticipated when he hired someone to provide professional childcare. He had no idea that the complexity was about to increase exponentially, or that the careful balance they had achieved was about to be shattered by forces he hadn't even considered. November arrived in New York with the kind of crisp clarity that made the city feel simultaneously energizing and melancholy. The trees in Central Park burst into brilliant reds and golds before surrendering their leaves to the approaching winter, and the light that slanted through the penthouse windows carried the particular quality that reminded everyone that change was inevitable, whether you were prepared for it or not. Camera Westfield's return was scheduled for the second week of November, and Elric found himself approaching her homecoming with feelings he couldn't quite categorize. 6 months ago, when she had left for her extended business assignment in London, he had been looking forward to their reunion with uncomplicated anticipation. Camera represented stability, partnership, and a vision of the future that included the elegant family life he thought he wanted to build. But 6 months ago, his relationship with his son had been politely distant, and his household had been run by a series of competent but forgettable employees. Now, everything had changed in ways that he wasn't sure how to explain to the woman he was supposed to marry. "She's going to love meeting you properly," he told Mara one morning as they reviewed the upcoming schedule changes that Camera's return would necessitate. "I've told her how wonderful you've been with Bram." Mara smiled politely, but Elric noticed a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I'm looking forward to meeting her as well," she said diplomatically. "Will there be any changes to Bram's routine that I should prepare him for?" It was a reasonable question, but it highlighted issues that Elric had been avoiding thinking about. Camera had strong opinions about child-rearing and family structure. She believed in clear boundaries, consistent discipline, and the importance of children learning to respect authority figures. She had often expressed concern about modern parents who, in her view, catered too much to their children's emotional needs at the expense of teaching them resilience and self-reliance. More specifically, Camera had definite ideas about the role of domestic staff in family life. She believed in maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and had criticized what she saw as the tendency of some families to allow employees to become too emotionally involved with their children. "We'll discuss it when she gets back," Elric said evasively. "I'm sure we can work out arrangements that make everyone comfortable." But even as he said it, he knew that making everyone comfortable was going to be more complicated than he wanted to admit. Camera expected to return to a household where she could step naturally into the role of stepmother to a well-behaved child cared for by professional but appropriately distant staff. What she would find instead was a family dynamic that had evolved in ways that didn't fit her vision of how such relationships should be structured. The first sign of trouble came 2 days before Camera's scheduled return, when Bram innocently asked a question that stopped Elric's heart. "Daddy," he said over breakfast, "when Camera comes back, will I still be able to spend time with Mama Mara?" The casual use of Mama Mara hit Elric like cold water. When had that started? How had he not noticed that his son was referring to their nanny with a maternal title that belonged to Sarah's memory? "Bram," he said carefully, "Mara isn't your mama. She's your nanny. You should call her by her name." The correction was gentle but firm, and it had the immediate effect of making both Bram and Mara look uncomfortable in ways that told Elric this conversation was long overdue. "But she takes care of me like a mama," Bram said, confused by the sudden emphasis on titles that had never seemed important before. "She reads me stories and helps me when I'm sad and makes me feel safe. Isn't that what mamas do?" The innocent logic of his statement was undeniable, and it highlighted the central problem that Elric had been unconsciously allowing to develop. In the absence of his own consistent presence, and without any other maternal figure in Bram's life, Mara had naturally evolved into a role that transcended traditional employment boundaries. "Mamas and nannies both take care of children," Elric explained, aware that both Bram and Mara were listening to every word with intense attention. "But they're different kinds of relationships. Mara is someone who works for our family and cares about you very much. But she's not your mama." "Why not?" The question was asked with the directness that only children possess, without any awareness of the complexity it revealed. Elric found himself struggling to articulate an answer that made sense without hurting anyone's feelings. Because mamas are, well, they're permanent. They're part of your family forever. People who work for us might not always be with us. The explanation was logical but devastating in its implications. Bram's face fell as he processed the idea that Mara might not always be part of his life, and Mara herself looked stricken by the reminder that her relationship with him was fundamentally temporary and contingent. Is Mara going away? Bram's voice was small and worried. No, sweetheart, Elric said quickly, realizing he had handled the conversation badly. Mara isn't going anywhere right now. I just want you to understand that there are different kinds of people who care about you, and they all have different names. But the damage was done. For the rest of the morning, Bram was subdued and clingy, and Mara moved through her duties with a professional distance that hadn't been present for weeks. The easy intimacy that had developed between them felt suddenly fragile and inappropriate, poisoned by the reminder of boundaries that money and employment contracts created regardless of emotional attachments. That evening, after Bram was in bed, Elric found Mara in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner with the kind of focused intensity that people use when they're trying not to think about something troubling. We need to talk, he said, settling at the kitchen island while she continued wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. Yes, sir, she said, and the return to formal address felt like a step backward from the comfortable relationship they had developed over the past months. About this morning, Elric began. About Bram calling you what he calls you. I've tried to discourage it, Mara said quickly, though they both knew this wasn't entirely true. But children sometimes attach titles that feel natural to them, regardless of what adults prefer. I understand that, and I'm not blaming you. But Camera is coming back, and she has strong feelings about family structure and appropriate boundaries. It's going to be important that Bram understands the difference between his relationship with you and his relationships with family members. Mara nodded, though her hands stilled in their cleaning motion. Of course, I'll work on helping him understand those distinctions. I also think, Elric continued, feeling like he was navigating a minefield, that we should probably establish some guidelines about activities and routines. Camera will want to be involved in Bram's care, and we'll need to make sure there's room for her to develop her own relationship with him. What kind of guidelines? Mara's voice was carefully neutral, but Elric could hear the tension underneath. I'm not sure yet. We'll figure out when she gets back, but probably fewer personal activities. More focus on educational and developmental goals rather than the kind of informal bonding that's been happening. The words sounded cold and bureaucratic even as he said them, reducing the warm, nurturing relationship that had developed between Mara and Bram to a series of professional objectives and measurable outcomes. I see, Mara said quietly, and if Bram has difficulty adjusting to those changes, he'll adjust, Elric said with more confidence than he felt. Children are resilient. He'll learn to see you in your proper role and to develop appropriate relationships with the people who will actually be permanent parts of his family. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Elric tried to convince himself that the conversation had been necessary and productive. Camera deserved to come home to a household where she could naturally assume her place as his partner and Bram's stepmother. Professional boundaries existed for good reasons, and allowing them to blur had created complications that were ultimately unfair to everyone involved. But he couldn't shake the memory of Bram's stricken face when he realized that Mara might not always be part of his life, or the way Mara's shoulders had set with resignation when she understood that the relationship she had built with his son would need to be restructured to accommodate someone else's comfort level. Most troubling of all, Elric was beginning to recognize that his own feelings about the situation were more complicated than he wanted to admit. He was grateful to Mara for bringing joy and stability to Bram's life, but he was also threatened by the depth of their connection and his own peripheral role in his son's daily happiness. The truth that he wasn't ready to face was that he was jealous of the easy affection between Mara and Bram, jealous of the way his son's face lit up when she entered a room, jealous of the natural maternal instincts that she brought to childcare while he struggled to figure out how to connect with his own son. And underneath the jealousy was an even more uncomfortable recognition that Mara was succeeding at parenting his child because she was doing all the things that he should have been doing but hadn't. Her relationship with Bram highlighted his own failures as a father in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Camera's return was going to force all of these issues into the open, and Elric had no idea how to manage the emotional complexity that was about to explode in his carefully ordered household. He fell asleep that night with a growing sense of dread, unaware that the conversation he'd had with Mara had planted seeds of doubt and insecurity that would soon grow into something far more destructive than he could have imagined. Camera Westfield stepped off her flight from London at JFK Airport with the same precision and confidence that had defined her entire 6-month assignment. Her luggage was perfectly organized, her itinerary had been planned to the minute, and her expectations for reintegrating into Elric's life were clear and detailed. During the taxi ride to Manhattan, she reviewed the notes she had made during their phone conversations over the past months. Elric had told her about hiring a new nanny who was working out very well with Bram. He had mentioned that his son seemed happier and more engaged. He had even admitted to spending more time at home, participating in bedtime routines and family dinners in ways that hadn't happened since Sarah's death. All of this should have been cause for celebration. Camera had long felt that Elric's relationship with Bram needed attention, that his work-focused lifestyle was creating unnecessary distance between father and son. She had encouraged him to be more present, more emotionally available, more willing to prioritize family time over business obligations. What she hadn't anticipated was how dramatically the household dynamic would shift in her absence, or how thoroughly someone else would fill the maternal role she had been planning to assume gradually and naturally after their marriage. The first sign that things were not as she expected came when she arrived at the penthouse. Instead of being greeted by Elric alone, with Bram perhaps making a polite appearance before being taken care of by household staff, she found a scene of domestic intimacy that immediately set her on edge. Elric was in the kitchen, wearing jeans and a casual sweater instead of his usual business attire, helping a woman she didn't immediately recognize prepare what appeared to be an elaborate lunch. Bram was perched on a stool at the kitchen island, chattering enthusiastically about something while the woman, who must be the nanny, listened with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for matters of great importance. Elric's face lit up when he saw her, and he crossed the kitchen to embrace her warmly. "You're early. We weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "My flight was ahead of schedule," she said, returning his hug while studying the scene over his shoulder. "I see you've been busy." "We're making lunch for Mrs. Patterson," Bram announced, sliding down from his stool to give Camera an enthusiastic hug. "She's been sad since her husband died, so we're taking her soup and sandwiches and cookies that we made ourselves." The casual assumption that we included all 3 adults in the kitchen was noted and filed away for later discussion. "That's very thoughtful of you, sweetheart," Camera said, kneeling to Bram's level. "Did you miss me while I was gone?" "Yes," Bram said with the generous enthusiasm of a child who found it easy to love multiple people simultaneously. "But I had Daddy and Mama Mara to take care of me, so I wasn't lonely." Camera's smile faltered almost imperceptibly at the casual use of Mama Mara, but she recovered quickly. "I see. And this is Mara." The woman in question stepped forward, wiping her hands on a dish towel before extending one to Camera. "Ms. Westfield, it's lovely to meet you properly. Bram has been so excited about your return." Mara was not what Camera had expected. Based on Elric's descriptions, she had pictured someone more institutional, more clearly delineated as household staff. Instead, she found a woman who moved through the kitchen with the comfort of someone at home, who interacted with both Elric and Bram with natural familiarity, who seemed less like an employee and more like a member of the family. "Thank you," Camera said politely. "I understand you've been taking excellent care of Bram." "It's been my pleasure," Mara replied, and the warmth in her voice when she glanced at Bram was unmistakable. "He's a wonderful child." What followed was a lunch that felt like an audition for a play where everyone was reading from different scripts. Camera tried to re-establish her place in Elric's life while observing the dynamics that had developed in her absence. Elric attempted to balance his attention between his fiancée and the household routine that had become comfortable for him and Bram. Mara worked to remain appropriately in the background while still responding to Bram's constant attempts to include her in every conversation. And Bram, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, chattered happily about everything that had happened during Camera's absence. "Mama Mara taught me how to make pancakes shaped like animals," he announced at one point. "And she reads me stories with different voices for all the characters. And she helped me write a letter to Santa Claus even though it's still November, because she said it's never too early to think about being grateful for what you have." Each casual reference to Mama Mara felt like a small slap to Camera, highlighting how thoroughly this woman had insinuated herself into Bram's emotional life during her absence. "That all sounds lovely," Camera said with carefully controlled pleasantness. "I'm sure Mara has been very helpful." After lunch, when they had delivered food to Mrs. Patterson and Bram had been settled with quiet activities in his room, Camera finally had the private conversation with Elric that she had been anticipating since her arrival. "She calls her Mama," Camera said without preamble as soon as they were alone in Elric's study. "I know," Elric said, running his hands through his hair in the gesture she recognized as his way of buying time when he didn't want to discuss something. "It started a few weeks ago. I've been trying to discourage it." "Have you?" Camera's tone was skeptical, because from what I observed at lunch, everyone seems quite comfortable with the arrangement. Elric was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out how to explain the complexity of the situation without making it sound like he had lost control of his own household. "It's complicated, Cam." Bram was struggling before Mara arrived. He was withdrawn, barely eating, having nightmares. "She's helped him tremendously. I'm sure she has, and I'm grateful for that. But there's a difference between providing good child care and replacing his dead mother in his affections." The harsh words hung between them, and Elric felt something cold settle in his stomach. "She hasn't replaced Sarah. She's just filled a void that needed filling. A void that I was planning to fill," Camera said quietly. "When we marry, I was expecting to become Bram's stepmother. I was planning to be the primary maternal figure in his life. How exactly is that supposed to work when he's already transferred those feelings to the nanny?" It was a reasonable question, and one that Elric had been avoiding thinking about for weeks. The truth was that he hadn't considered how Camera's return would affect the relationships that had developed in her absence, or how the presence of a strong maternal figure might complicate his fiancée's plans to assume that role herself. "We'll work it out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Children are adaptable. He'll learn to adjust to new arrangements." "Will he?" Camera stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the city below. "Elric, I love you, and I want to build a life with you and help you raise Bram. But I won't compete with household staff for my place in this family. That woman needs to understand her role and maintain appropriate boundaries." "What are you suggesting?" Camera turned back to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. "I'm suggesting that we need to re-establish clear lines between family and employees. Bram needs to understand that Mara is his nanny, not his mother figure. And Mara needs to step back from the intimate, familial relationship she's developed with him. And if that hurts Bram, if it damages the progress he's made, children recover from disappointments," Camera said firmly. "They don't recover from confused attachments and inappropriate boundaries. The longer this continues, the harder it will be to correct." That evening, Camera insisted on putting Bram to bed herself, establishing what she saw as the beginning of her proper role in his nighttime routine. Elric watched from the doorway as she read him a story with professional competence, but without the theatrical voices and patient explanations that Bram had grown accustomed to receiving from Mara. "Where's Mama Mara?" Bram asked when Camera finished the story and moved to turn off his light. "Mara is cleaning up downstairs," Camera said. "But I'm here now. I can take care of your bedtime routine." "But I want to say good night to Mama Mara," Bram insisted, sitting up in bed. "She always gives me hugs and tells me she loves me before I go to sleep." Camera felt a flash of irritation at this evidence of how deeply the inappropriate attachment had developed. Bram, you need to stop calling her mama. Her name is Mara, and she's your nanny. I'm going to be your stepmother when your daddy and I get married. Do you understand the difference? Bram looked confused and slightly hurt by the correction. But she takes care of me like a mama, he said in a small voice. She loves me and I love her. Isn't that what makes someone a mama? The innocent question highlighted the fundamental problem with the situation. In Bram's world, love and care and daily presence were what defined maternal relationships, not legal documents or social conventions. He couldn't understand why the woman who functioned as his primary caregiver and emotional support couldn't be called by the title that felt natural to him. Love isn't enough to make someone your mama, Camera explained, trying to keep her voice gentle despite her growing frustration. Being a mama is about being part of your family forever. Mara works for us, which means she might not always be here. You can't depend on employees the same way you depend on family. The words were intended to clarify boundaries, but their effect on Bram was devastating. His face crumpled as he processed the idea that Mara might disappear from his life, that his love for her and hers for him didn't guarantee permanence or security. Is Mama Mara going away? He asked, his voice trembling. Camera realized she had handled the conversation badly, but felt committed to the position she had taken. Not right now, she said, but you need to understand that she's not really your mama. Your real mama was Sarah, and she's in heaven. I'm going to be your new mama when I marry your daddy. But I don't want a new mama, Bram said, tears beginning to flow. I want Mama Sarah in heaven and Mama Mara here with me. Why can't I have both? It was a reasonable question from a child's perspective, but it highlighted the emotional complexity that adults had created through their need to categorize and control relationships. Camera found herself struggling to explain why love had to be exclusive, why titles mattered more than feelings, why legal and social structures should override emotional bonds. Because that's not how families work, she said finally, aware that her explanation was inadequate but unsure how else to address the situation. Bram cried himself to sleep that night, calling for Mara, but being told that it was time to learn new routines. Camera sat with him until his breathing evened out, feeling like she had won a battle but lost something important in the process. Downstairs, Mara had heard enough of the conversation to understand that her relationship with Bram was about to change dramatically, whether she wanted it to or not. She spent the evening packing her belongings and trying to prepare herself for a conversation that she knew was coming. And Elric, caught between the woman he loved and the child who needed stability more than anything else, realized that his attempts to manage everyone's feelings and expectations had created a situation that was about to explode in ways he couldn't control or prevent. The dinner party was Camera's idea, conceived as a way to reestablish their social presence as a couple and demonstrate the elegant family life they were building together. She had spent 3 days planning every detail with the precision of a military campaign. The guest list carefully curated to include Elric's most important business associates, the menu designed to showcase sophisticated tastes, the decor arranged to highlight the penthouse's architectural perfection. It's important that people see us as a cohesive unit, she explained to Elric while reviewing the seating arrangements. The Hendersons, the Yamadas, the Mortimers, these are relationships that will matter for your expansion into international markets. They need to see us as a stable, successful family. Elric agreed, though he felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came with performing their perfect life for an audience. The past 2 weeks since Camera's return had been a delicate balancing act that left everyone feeling slightly off balance. Camera had been working systematically to reestablish what she saw as appropriate boundaries between family and staff, while Bram struggled to understand why his relationships were suddenly being redefined and restricted. Mara had responded to the new regime with professional grace, stepping back from the intimate, familial interactions that had developed naturally over the previous months. She still provided excellent care for Bram, but now it felt more formal, more distant, more like the employment relationship it had technically always been. The change was hardest on Bram, who couldn't understand why the woman he loved was suddenly less available for hugs and conversations, why bedtime stories were now read by camera with efficient competence rather than Mara with theatrical enthusiasm, why his requests to spend time with Mama Mara were consistently redirected toward activities with his father and future stepmother. "Can I help Mara make cookies today?" he had asked that morning, only to be told that Camera would be teaching him to bake instead as part of their bonding activities. "But Mara knows how I like to do it," Bram protested with the logical clarity of a child who couldn't understand why working systems were being unnecessarily disrupted. "You'll learn to do it Camera's way," Elric had said, trying to sound encouraging rather than arbitrarily authoritative. "She has wonderful ideas for things you can do together." But Bram's enthusiasm for these mandated bonding sessions was tepid at best, and Camera found herself working harder than she had expected to connect with a child who seemed to be perpetually waiting for someone else to arrive and make everything feel natural again. The dinner party was intended to mark a turning point, the successful reintegration of Camera into their household and the establishment of new family traditions that didn't revolve around the nanny's central role in Bram's emotional life. The guests arrived punctually at 7 o'clock, each couple dressed in the kind of elegant evening where that suggested both wealth and taste. The penthouse had been transformed into something that belonged in a lifestyle magazine. Perfect flowers, perfect lighting, perfect place settings that reflected Camera's impeccable sense of style and attention to detail. Elric moved through the early part of the evening with practiced ease, discussing real estate trends and international investment opportunities, while Camera charmed the women with insights into European business culture and fashion. The conversation flowed smoothly between topics designed to showcase their sophistication and success. Bram made his scheduled appearance during the cocktail hour, dressed in his best clothes and carefully coached on appropriate behavior. He shook hands with the adults, answered polite questions about kindergarten and his favorite subjects, and demonstrated the kind of well-mannered charm that reflected positively on his upbringing. "What a delightful child," Mrs. Henderson observed to Camera. "So articulate and well-behaved. You must be very proud." "Thank you," Camera replied, accepting the compliment on behalf of the family she was working to establish. "We believe in teaching children respect and proper social skills from an early age." Mara remained in the background during these interactions, essentially invisible to the guests, but present enough to monitor Bram's needs and ensure his comfort. She had been instructed to keep a low profile during the evening, to function as staff rather than as the quasi-family member she had been for the previous months. The problems began during dinner, when Bram's careful behavior started to deteriorate under the stress of an unfamiliar social situation. The dining room felt different from their usual family meals. The formal place, settings, and multiple courses were confusing. The adult conversation was loud and focused on topics he didn't understand. Most unsettling of all, the people he depended on for comfort and security seemed different in front of guests. More performative, less available, more concerned with making good impressions than with his emotional needs. "Bram, sit up straight," Camera murmured during the soup course, noticing his posture was beginning to slump. "Use your napkin," Elric added when a drop of soup escaped his spoon. The corrections were mild and reasonable, but they contributed to Bram's growing sense that he was being watched and judged rather than simply included in a family gathering. He began to fidget, to lose focus, to show signs of the overstimulation that Mara would normally have recognized and addressed with quiet intervention. But Mara was seated in the kitchen, eating her own dinner while remaining available if needed, but explicitly excluded from the family dynamic that was being performed for the guests. The conversation during the main course turned to child-rearing philosophies, a topic that always generated strong opinions among Manhattan's elite social circles. "Children today are simply too indulged," Mrs. Henderson declared, gesturing with her wine glass for emphasis. "In my day, children were seen and not heard during adult gatherings. They learned respect by observing proper behavior, not by being catered to constantly." "I completely agree," Camera said, shooting a meaningful glance at Elric. "Children need clear boundaries and consistent expectations. It's important not to confuse love with permissiveness, Absolutely, added Mr. Yamada. In Japanese culture, we understand that discipline is a form of love. Children thrive when they know exactly what is expected of them. Bram, who had been listening to this conversation with the absorbed attention of a child trying to understand adult priorities, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that had always characterized his contributions to family discussions. But Mama Mara says love means being patient even when someone makes mistakes, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. She says that's how you know someone really loves you, because they're kind to you even when you mess up. The silence that followed was deafening. Every adult at the table turned to look at the small boy who had just referred to household staff as Mama in front of some of Manhattan's most influential families. Camera's face flushed deep red. Elric's hand tightened around his wine glass until his knuckles went white. Mrs. Henderson raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow with the kind of predatory curiosity that society columnists paid handsomely to witness. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Henderson said with sweet venom. "Did he just call the nanny mama?" Before anyone could respond, Bram, sensing that he had said something wrong but not understanding what, looked around the table with growing anxiety. The adult faces staring back at him carried expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval to barely concealed amusement. "Mama," he called out, his voice small and uncertain, seeking the comfort of the person who had always made him feel safe when he was confused or scared. "Mama Mara, did I say something bad?" The second use of the title hit the room like a lightning strike. Guests exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Camera's fork clattered against her plate, and Elric felt the careful facade of his perfect life beginning to crumble around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. But before anyone could respond, before the situation could be managed or explained or smoothed over with adult sophistication, disaster struck in its purest form. As Bram tried to look around for Mara, his elbow caught the edge of his water glass, sending it tumbling toward the table's edge. In his panic to catch it, he knocked into the crystal pitcher that had been placed within his reach, sending water and broken glass cascading across the white tablecloth and onto the hardwood floor. "Oh no!" Bram cried out, his distress now complete. "I broke it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The sound of shattering crystal seemed to release all the pent-up tension in the room. Guests pushed back from the table to avoid the spreading water. Mrs. Henderson made a show of dabbing at her dress where a few drops had splashed. And Bram, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistake and the obvious displeasure of the adults around him, began to cry with the desperate intensity of a child whose world had suddenly become incomprehensible and hostile. It was then that Mara appeared, drawn by the sound of breaking glass and Bram's distressed crying. Without hesitation, she knelt beside his chair, careful to avoid the broken crystal scattered across the floor. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice immediately switching to the soothing tone she used for his nightmares and medical emergencies. "It was an accident. Accidents happen. You're not in trouble." "But everyone's mad at me," Bram sobbed, throwing his arms around her neck and burying his face against her shoulder. "And I don't know what I did wrong. I just wanted to tell them that you love me." "I do love you," Mara whispered, holding him close despite the awkward position and the roomful of staring adults. "So very much. And you didn't do anything wrong, baby." And that's when Bram, seeking comfort in the chaos of broken glass and adult disapproval, said the words that would change everything. "I love you too, Mommy. You're the best mommy in the whole world." The word mommy fell into the silence of the dining room like a bomb with a very short fuse. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the soft drip of spilled water and Bram's gradually quieting sniffles against Mara's shoulder. Then Camera erupted with a fury that surprised everyone, including herself. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice sharp enough to shatter what remained of the crystal. "This has gone entirely too far. Bram, get away from her this instant." But Bram, already overwhelmed by the evening's chaos and now frightened by the anger radiating from Camera, only clung more tightly to the person who represented safety and unconditional love in a small world. "No," he said, his voice muffled but surprisingly firm for someone so young. "I want my mama." "She's not your mama." Camera's careful composure shattered completely, revealing the frustration and jealousy that had been building for weeks. "Your mama is dead, and this woman is the hired help. This is completely inappropriate, and it stops right now." The cruelty of the words hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Bram's face went white with shock and pain. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even Mrs. Henderson, who thrived on social drama, looked taken aback by the harshness of Camera's statement. But it was Mara who responded first, rising slowly to her feet with Bram still in her arms, her voice quiet but steady with a dignity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere professionalism. "Please don't," she said, looking directly at Camera. "Please don't use his grief as a weapon. He knows his mother is gone. He's not trying to replace her memory. He's just trying to love the people who love him back." The simple eloquence of her response made Camera's attack seem even more vicious by comparison, but also triggered something darker in the woman who had spent 6 months planning her return to find another woman occupying the maternal space she had intended to claim. "How dare you?" Camera said, taking a step closer, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. "How dare you lecture me about this child's welfare when you're the one who has manipulated him into this inappropriate attachment? You've been playing house with another woman's child, encouraging him to call you by a title you have no right to claim." "I never encouraged," Mara began, but Camera cut her off with the ruthless precision of someone who had found a target for months of accumulated frustration. "You absolutely did. You could have corrected him. You could have maintained appropriate boundaries. Instead, you've allowed him to transfer his mother's memory onto you because it made you feel important, feel needed. You've manipulated a grieving child for your own emotional satisfaction. The accusation was designed to wound, and it found its target with devastating accuracy." Mara's face went pale as the words hit her deepest fear about her own motivations. The worry that her love for Bram might be tainted by her own need to mother someone, anyone, after losing Marcus. "You think I manipulated him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her arms still protective around Bram, who was now crying quietly against her shoulder. "You think I used his grief for my own benefit? I think you saw an opportunity to play mother to a vulnerable child, and you took it," Camera said with cold precision. "I think you've been living out your own fantasy at the expense of his emotional development. I think you've confused a lonely child about his family structure for your own selfish reasons." It was then that Elric, who had been sitting frozen in his chair watching this confrontation destroy his dinner party and traumatize his son, finally found his voice. But instead of stepping in to protect Mara or comfort Bram, instead of recognizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond acceptable bounds, he made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The combination of professional embarrassment, social humiliation, and his own unresolved guilt about his failures as a father created a perfect storm of poor judgment. Seeing Mara holding his crying son while his fiancée publicly accused her of manipulation, watching his business associates witness this family drama unfold with barely concealed fascination, feeling the weight of his own inadequacies as a parent laid bare for everyone to see, Elric's protective instincts went catastrophically wrong. Instead of defending the woman who had loved his son when he was too absent to do so properly, instead of removing Bram from the emotional battlefield or asking the guests to leave, Elric allowed his shame and anger and desperate need to regain control of the situation to override his humanity. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and reached for Mara's arm. Not gently, not with the care due to someone holding a distressed child, but with the rough urgency of someone whose priority was ending a scene rather than protecting the people involved in it. "Camera's right," he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't separate or control. "This has gone too far. You've overstepped your boundaries as an employee, and you've confused my son about your role in this family." Mara stared at him in shock, still holding Bram, who had stopped crying and was now looking between the adults with the wide-eyed terror of a child watching his world collapse in real time. "Mr. Van Loft," she said quietly, her voice carrying a plea that went beyond words, "please don't do this. Not here, not in front of him." But Elric was past rational thought, driven by a toxic combination of shame, embarrassment, and the desperate need to reclaim some authority in a situation that had made him look weak and incompetent in front of people whose opinions mattered to his business success. "You're supposed to be his nanny," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You're supposed to provide care and supervision, not emotional manipulation. You've made him dependent on you in ways that aren't healthy, and you've undermined my authority as his father." "I never undermined," Mara started, but Elric was beyond listening to explanations or defenses. "Every time he calls you mama, you undermine me," he shouted, his control finally snapping completely. "Every time you let him think of you as his mother, you make it harder for him to bond with me, with Camera, with anyone who should actually be in his life permanently." The words were cruel and unfair, born from his own deep shame about his failures as a parent and his desperate need to blame someone else for problems he had created through his own emotional absence. Everyone in the room knew they were unfair. The guests, Camera, even Elric himself, but they had been spoken in anger and couldn't be taken back. Mara stood there absorbing the weight of his accusations while still holding the child she loved more than her own life. And when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "I see," she said quietly. "I understand." She moved to put Bram down, to step away from the situation with whatever dignity she could preserve, but Bram clung to her with desperate strength. "No, Mama," he cried out, his voice breaking with terror and confusion. "Don't go. Please don't leave me. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." And that's when Elric, driven by shame and rage and the terrible pressure of being judged by people whose approval he needed for his professional success, crossed a line that would define him for the rest of his life. He raised his hand and slapped Mara across the face. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Bram screamed in terror. The guests gasped audibly, and Mara stumbled backward, her hand instinctively going to her cheek while she struggled to process the violence that had just erupted in this elegant room. But before anyone else could react, before Elric could begin to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done, Camera did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She stepped forward and slapped Elric right back. The sound was just as sharp, just as shocking. Elric's head snapped to the side, and he staggered, more from surprise than from the physical impact. "You bastard," Camera said, her voice deadly quiet in the sudden silence. "You absolute bastard." The dining room erupted into chaos. Guests pushed back from the table, some standing, others grabbing their purses and coats in obvious preparation for a hasty exit. Mrs. Henderson was already texting what would undoubtedly become the most scandalous gossip of the social season. But in the middle of the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Camera, the woman who had been systematically trying to displace Mara in Bram's affections, walked over to where the terrified child stood frozen with shock and knelt down to his level. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle and protective in stark contrast to the fury she had displayed moments before. "You don't need to see this anymore." Bram looked up at her with confusion and gratitude and allowed her to take his hand and lead him away from the wreckage of the evening. As they passed Elric, who was still standing in stunned silence with his hand pressed to his cheek, Camera stopped and looked at him with disgust and disappointment that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a door being closed forever. "And you're certainly not the man worthy of being that child's father." With that, she led Bram out of the dining room, leaving Elric alone with his guests, his employee, and the complete destruction of everything he thought he had under control. The dinner party was over. The engagement was over. And the careful structure that had held the Van Loft household together was shattered beyond any possibility of simple repair. In the silence that followed, with Mara standing quietly with tears streaming down her face and the guests beginning their awkward exodus, Elric finally understood what he had done. Not just the slap, though that was unforgivable enough, but the deeper damage. He had chosen his pride over his son's emotional welfare, his social standing over the woman who had loved his child when he was too absent to do so himself. He had become exactly the kind of man he had always despised. Someone who used power to hurt people who couldn't defend themselves, someone who sacrificed love for appearances, someone who put his own comfort ahead of a child's need for security and protection. Standing in his ruined dining room, surrounded by the debris of his perfect life, Elric realized that he had lost everything that actually mattered while trying to protect things that were ultimately meaningless. And the worst part was that he had no idea how to begin fixing damage that felt irreparable, or whether the people he had hurt would ever give him the chance to try. The Van Loft penthouse had never felt larger or more echo-filled than it did in the weeks following what everyone would forever refer to as the disaster. The perfect rooms that had once showcased Elric's success now felt like a museum of his failures, each carefully curated space a reminder of how thoroughly he had destroyed everything that gave his wealth meaning. The guests had left that night with the efficiency of people escaping a natural disaster, taking with them stories that would fuel Manhattan society gossip for months. Mrs. Henderson's account of the evening would become legendary in certain circles. The night a millionaire lost his mind and struck his nanny in front of New York's elite, only to be slapped back by his own fiancée. But the social embarrassment, devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the human wreckage left in the aftermath. Mara had packed her belongings and left that same night, disappearing into the city with a quiet dignity that somehow made her departure more devastating than if she had slammed doors or made accusations. She simply gathered her few possessions, accepted Elric's stammered apologies with polite acknowledgement, and walked out of their lives carrying her small suitcase and the weight of everyone's unresolved emotions. Camera had stayed long enough to help settle Bram for the night, but her departure the following morning was accompanied by the removal of her engagement ring and a conversation that left no doubt about the permanence of their separation. "I can't marry a man who would strike a woman for loving his child," she had said, her voice calm but implacable. "I can't build a life with someone who chooses violence when his pride is threatened. And I can't be a stepmother to a boy who will always remember that I helped create the situation that drove away the person he loved most." Elric had tried to argue, to explain, to convince her that the man who had lost control that night wasn't the real him. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. The capacity for that kind of cruelty had always been inside him. He had just never been forced to confront it before. So he was left alone with Bram in their perfect penthouse, trying to figure out how to rebuild a relationship with a son who looked at him now with wariness and grief instead of love and trust. The change in Bram was immediate and heartbreaking. The bright, curious child who had been flourishing under Mara's care disappeared, replaced by someone smaller, quieter, more careful about expressing needs or emotions that might cause problems for the adults around him. He stopped eating with any enthusiasm, picking at meals until they grew cold while staring at the empty place at the table where Mara used to sit. He stopped asking questions about the world around him, as if curiosity itself had become dangerous. Most devastatingly, he stopped seeking comfort when he was hurt or scared, having learned that the people he depended on could become unpredictably violent when stressed. "He keeps asking for her," reported Margaret Collins, the new nanny whom Elric had hired with desperate haste. Margaret was everything the agency had promised: experienced, professional, unflappable. She had impeccable credentials and 20 years of experience with high-profile families. She was also, as Bram made clear through his complete indifference to her presence, not Mara. "He asks for Mama Mara when he wakes up from nightmares," Margaret continued, her voice carefully neutral. "He saves food on his plate for her at dinner. Yesterday, he drew a picture of what he called our family and included her in it, even though she's been gone for 3 weeks." Elric listened to these reports with growing desperation and self-loathing. He had hired the best child psychologists in the city, but their gentle probing and play therapy sessions couldn't address the fundamental problem. Bram was grieving the loss of someone who had been more present and emotionally available than his own father. Children are remarkably resilient, Dr. Sarah Chan had assured him during one of their consultations. With time and consistency, he'll adjust to the new arrangements and form appropriate attachments to the caregivers who are actually permanent parts of his life. But Dr. Chun hadn't seen the way Bram's face went blank when Margaret tried to read him bedtime stories, or how he flinched away from physical comfort, as if touch itself had become unpredictable and potentially threatening. She hadn't witnessed the careful way he monitored adult emotions now, constantly scanning for signs that his behavior might trigger another explosion of incomprehensible violence. The worst part, from Elric's perspective, was that his increased presence at home, the silver lining he had hoped might come from this disaster, seemed to make no difference in Bram's emotional state. He had rearranged his schedule to be home for dinner every night, to participate in bedtime routines, to spend weekends focused on father-son activities instead of business obligations. But all of his efforts felt strained and artificial, like someone learning lines for a play about being a good parent rather than actually connecting with his child. He could provide supervision and entertainment and educational opportunities, but he couldn't provide the effortless emotional attunement that Mara had brought to every interaction with Bram. "Daddy," Bram said one evening as Elric attempted to read him a bedtime story, "when is Mama Mara coming back?" It was the same question every night, delivered with the hopeful persistence of a child who couldn't quite accept that some departures were permanent. "Buddy, we've talked about this," Elric said gently, though his heart broke a little more each time he had to deliver this news. "Mara had to go away. She won't be coming back." "But why?" The question was asked without drama, but with the weight of genuine confusion. "Did I do something wrong? Is she mad at me for calling her mama?" The innocence of the question was devastating. Here was his son, trying to make sense of an adult situation by assuming responsibility for events that had nothing to do with his behavior. The 5-year-old mind couldn't comprehend the complexities of professional boundaries and social expectations and adult pride. All he knew was that the person he loved most had disappeared from his life without explanation or warning. "No, sweetheart," Elric said, setting aside the book they weren't really reading anyway. "You didn't do anything wrong. Mara isn't mad at you. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt other grown-ups, and then things have to change." "What kind of mistakes?" How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his father had allowed social embarrassment and wounded pride to override basic human decency? How do you tell a child that the reason his primary source of comfort and security had vanished was because you had chosen to protect your reputation instead of the people you were supposed to love? The kind of mistakes that hurt people's feelings very badly, Elric said finally. The kind that are hard to fix. Bram considered this with the serious concentration he brought to all important matters. "Did you say sorry?" "Yes, buddy. I said sorry. And she's still not coming back." "No, she's not coming back." Bram was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the kind of mental effort that no child should have to expend. "Daddy," he said finally, his voice very small, "are you going to go away too?" The question hit Elric like a physical blow. In all his worry about Bram's grief over losing Mara, he hadn't considered that his son might now doubt the permanence of any relationship in his life. First, his mother had left through death. Then Mara had left through his father's actions. And now Bram was living with the fear that everyone he loved might disappear without warning. "No, buddy," Elric said firmly, pulling his son closer in the first physical contact Bram had initiated in weeks. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm your daddy, and I'll always be your daddy. I'll always be here. Promise? I promise." But even as he made the vow, Elric realized that being physically present wasn't enough. He had been technically there for most of Bram's life, but his emotional absence had created the void that Mara had filled. If he wanted to rebuild his relationship with his son, he was going to have to learn how to be genuinely present, not just geographically available. The next morning, Elric did something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. He called in sick to work, not for a medical emergency or a family crisis, but simply because he needed to spend time with his son and figure out how to connect with him in ways that went beyond supervision and entertainment. He found Bram in the kitchen with Margaret, listlessly eating toast while she attempted to engage him in conversation about his upcoming school day. The contrast with the animated breakfast conversations he had shared with Mara was stark and heartbreaking. "Hey, buddy," Elric said, pouring himself coffee and settling at the kitchen island. "How would you like to play hooky with me today?" Bram looked up with the first spark of interest he'd shown in weeks. "What's hooky?" "It means we skip work and school and just spend the day together. We could go anywhere you want." "Anywhere? Anywhere." Bram thought for a moment, his face cycling through emotions that were too complex for someone his age to be experiencing. "Can we go see where Mama Mara lives? I just want to know if she's okay." The request was innocent, but loaded with implications that made Elric's stomach clench with guilt and longing. His first instinct was to deflect, to suggest alternative activities that didn't involve confronting the mess he had made of all their lives. But looking at his son's careful hopefulness, Elric realized that this wasn't about his own comfort or convenience. This was about helping Bram process the loss of someone who had been central to his daily life, and maybe, if he was very lucky, finding a way to begin healing the damage his actions had caused. "You know what?" Elric said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should check on Mara and make sure she's all right." The smile that spread across Bram's face was like sunrise after the longest night. For the first time in weeks, he looked like a child instead of someone carrying burdens too heavy for his small shoulders. And for the first time since the disaster, Elric felt something that might eventually grow into hope. The address on Mara's employment file led them to a modest apartment building in Queens, a world away from the marble and glass towers of Manhattan, where Elric conducted his business and lived his carefully curated life. As their taxi pulled up to the building's entrance, Elric felt his nervousness increasing with each passing moment. What if she didn't want to see them? What if his presence was more harmful than helpful? What if Bram's hopes were raised only to be crushed again by rejection or indifference? But looking at his son's face pressed against the taxi window, studying the building with intense concentration as if trying to memorize every detail, Elric understood that this moment wasn't about his own anxiety or comfort. It was about Bram's need to know that someone he loved was safe and well, regardless of whether their relationship could continue in any meaningful form. The building was older but well-maintained, with the kind of character that comes from decades of housing working families who take pride in their homes even when they can't afford luxury. Climbing the stairs to Mara's third-floor apartment, Elric found himself thinking about how little he knew about her life outside his penthouse, how thoroughly he had treated her as an employee rather than as a person with her own needs, dreams, and circumstances. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Bram asked quietly as they reached her door, voicing the fear that had been growing in both of them during the journey. "Then we'll respect her wishes," Elric said, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "But we can at least try to let her know that we care about her and want to make sure she's okay." He knocked gently, and when the door opened, Mara's face cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief before settling into careful neutrality. "Mr. Van Loft," she said quietly. "Bram." But before Elric could speak, before he could begin the apology he had been rehearsing during the entire taxi ride, Bram launched himself forward with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had been afraid he might never see someone he loved again. "Mama Mar—" His face lit up with the first genuine happiness Elric had witnessed in weeks. "I missed you so much. Are you okay? Daddy said we could come check on you because I was worried." Mara knelt down to Bram's level automatically, her hands framing his face with the gentle attention that had always made him feel like the most important person in the world. "I missed you too, sweet boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to control. "So very much. And yes, I'm okay. Are you okay?" Bram nodded earnestly, though his small hands reached up to cover hers, as if to make sure she was real and present. "I brought you something," he said, digging in his jacket pocket. "I made this for you." He pulled out a slightly crumpled drawing, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with "I love you, Mama Mara" written in careful kindergarten letters across the top. "It's our family," he explained with the matter-of-fact clarity that had always characterized his view of relationships. You're still part of our family, even if you don't live with us anymore, right? Mara accepted the drawing with a reverence usually reserved for priceless artworks, her eyes filling with tears as she studied the careful representation of love that transcended traditional boundaries. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you. I'll treasure it always." Standing in the doorway of her modest apartment, watching this exchange between the woman who had loved his son and the child who still needed that love, Elric finally understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed through his inability to manage his own emotions and priorities. "Mara," he said quietly, could we talk?" She looked at him with an expression that was guarded but not hostile, as if she was willing to listen but had learned to protect herself from further disappointment. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let them enter her home. Mara's apartment was small but warm, filled with books and plants and photographs that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. She made tea while Bram explored her living room, exclaiming over a collection of children's books and a small piano in the corner that he remembered her mentioning during their conversations about music and learning. "You really do play piano, Mama Mara," he said, running his fingers over the keys with the reverent touch of a child who understood that some things were precious. "A little," she said, bringing the tea tray to the small kitchen table. "My grandmother taught me when I was about your age. Could you teach me?" The question was asked with the hopeful expectancy of a child who assumed that people he loved would naturally want to share their gifts with him. Mara glanced at Elric uncertainly, and he realized how carefully she was navigating the boundaries that his actions had created. "Well, that would be something to discuss with your daddy." "Bram," Elric said gently, "why don't you look at those books for a few minutes while Mara and I talk?" Bram settled on the floor with a stack of picture books, close enough to feel included, but distant enough to give the adults privacy for the conversation that everyone knew needed to happen. "I don't know where to start," Elric admitted, his voice low enough that Bram would have to strain to hear. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for weeks, and nothing feels adequate." "You don't owe me an explanation," Mara said carefully, though her posture suggested she was prepared for disappointment. "I understand that the situation became complicated." "No," Elric said firmly. "Don't do that. Don't minimize what I did or make excuses for it. I hit you, Mara. I humiliated you in front of people who had no right to judge your relationship with my son. I blamed you for problems that I created through my own failures as a father. There's no explanation that makes that acceptable." Mara was quiet for a moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether his words reflected genuine remorse or simply another attempt to manage a difficult situation. "Why are you here, Mr. Van Loft?" she asked finally. "Because my son is breaking apart without you," Elric said, the words coming out more raw than he had intended. "Because he stopped eating and playing and being himself. Because he asks for you every night, and I don't know how to help him understand why the person he loves most just disappeared from his life." And the single word carried weight, suggesting that there was more to his motivation than just Bram's welfare. "And because I need to understand how I became the kind of man who could do what I did to you," Elric continued, his voice steadier now. "Because I need to figure out how to be better, not just for him, but for me. Because I can't live with who I was that night." Mara sipped her tea, considering his words while Bram's quiet voice narrated the stories he was reading to himself in the background. "Mr. Van Loft," she said finally, "I appreciate you bringing Bram to see me. I was worried about him, and I'm glad to see that he's still himself, even if he's struggling. But I'm not sure what you want from me. I want to know if there's a way to fix this," Elric said simply. "Not go back to how things were, because that wasn't working either. But find a way forward that doesn't require Bram to lose someone he loves because his father couldn't handle his own emotions." "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Elric admitted. "I just know that cutting you out of his life completely isn't protecting him. It's punishing him for my mistakes. And I can't keep being the kind of father who puts his own comfort ahead of his son's emotional needs." From the floor, Bram's voice piped up with the clarity of a child who had been listening more carefully than the adults realized. "I think Daddy should say sorry to Mama Mara," he announced, looking up from his books. And then we should all be friends again, and maybe you could come have dinner with us sometimes and teach me piano like you said. The simple solution offered by a 5-year-old highlighted how unnecessarily complicated the adults had made everything. In Bram's world, wrong actions required apologies. Apologies led to forgiveness, and forgiveness allowed relationships to continue in new forms. Out of the mouths of babes, Mara murmured, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth for the first time since they'd arrived. Elric looked at his son, then back at Mara, and understood that this moment required more than words or promises or careful negotiations about boundaries and expectations. Mara, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse and recognition, I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I did to you. You loved my son when I was too absent and self-absorbed to do it properly. You filled gaps in his life that I should never have allowed to exist. You gave him stability and affection and the kind of patient, consistent care that every child deserves. And instead of being grateful, instead of learning from your example, I blamed you for my own failures and took out my shame and embarrassment on you in the most unforgivable way possible. He paused, making sure she could see the sincerity in his eyes before continuing. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. You didn't manipulate my son or overstep your boundaries. You loved him the way he needed to be loved, and I punished you for it because it highlighted how badly I was failing as his father. I'm sorry for hitting you. I'm sorry for humiliating you. I'm sorry for making you feel like your love for Bram was somehow inappropriate or unprofessional. And I'm sorry for being too proud and too scared to admit that you were a better parent to him than I was. Mara listened to the apology with the focused attention she had always given to important matters, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, she said finally, for saying that, for bringing him here so I could see that he's all right. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the complexity of the situation, for trying to figure out how to do better. Does that mean? Bram looked hopefully between them. Does that mean we can be friends again? Mara looked at Elric, and he could see her weighing the risks and possibilities of remaining connected to a family that had already caused her so much pain. I'd like that, sweet boy, she said carefully. But it would have to be different than before. I wouldn't be your nanny anymore. I'd just be your friend who cares about you and wants to see you sometimes. Could you still teach me piano? Mara laughed, the first genuine sound of joy that had filled the apartment since they'd arrived. Yes, I think I could still teach you piano. What followed was an hour of tentative but genuine reconnection. Mara showed Bram how to play simple melodies on her grandmother's piano. Elric found himself really listening to his son's chatter for the first time in weeks, hearing not just the words but the emotions and needs beneath them. And slowly, carefully, they began to sketch the outline of what a healthy, sustainable relationship might look like. We could meet at the park sometimes, Mara suggested, or you could come here for piano lessons on weekends. Nothing too structured, just keeping in touch. What about holidays? Bram asked with the practical concern of a child who wanted to make sure all important occasions were properly covered. We'll figure out as we go, Elric said, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like they actually might. When it was time to leave, Bram hugged Mara with the fierce intensity of someone who had been afraid he might never see her again. I love you, Mama Mara, he whispered against her shoulder. I love you too, little one, she replied. Always. As they walked to the taxi, Bram slipped his hand into Elric's with casual affection that hadn't been present for weeks. Daddy, he said as they settled into the back seat. Yes, buddy, I'm hungry. Can we get pancakes for lunch? It was such a normal, childlike request that Elric felt tears spring to his eyes. For the first time since the disaster of the dinner party, his son was expressing a desire for something, showing interest in the world around him, trusting that his needs would be met with care rather than irritation. Yeah, buddy, Elric said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. We can definitely get pancakes for lunch. The rebuilding happened slowly, in small moments and careful gestures that gradually accumulated into something that resembled healing. Every Saturday morning became piano lesson day, a sacred ritual that none of them would have dreamed of missing. Elric would drive Bram to Mara's apartment, and while she taught his son to play simple melodies, he would sit in her small kitchen, drinking coffee and marveling at the patience she showed for each repeated mistake, each frustrated sigh, each small triumph over a particularly challenging piece. Music is like feelings, he heard her tell Bram during one lesson. Sometimes it's happy and bouncy, sometimes it's sad and slow, but all of it is beautiful if you play it with your heart. These Saturday visits became a kind of sanctuary for all three of them. Away from the formal perfection of the penthouse, away from the pressure of recreating professional relationships or managing social expectations, they could simply be three people who cared about each other figuring out how to make that care work in practical terms. Elric found himself looking forward to these mornings almost as much as Bram did. There was something healing about sitting in Mara's sunny kitchen, listening to his son's laughter, watching the easy affection between them that he had once found threatening but now recognized as a gift that extended beyond traditional family boundaries. "He's getting better," Mara observed one morning as they watched Bram through the doorway, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked through a piece they'd been practicing for weeks. "He is," Elric agreed. "You should see him at home. He's eating again, asking questions, getting excited about things. It's like someone turned the lights back on inside him." "What about you?" Mara asked gently. "How are you doing with all of this?" It was the first time she had asked him a personal question since that day in her apartment, and Elric found himself surprised by how much he had been hoping someone would notice that he, too, had been changed by the events of the past months. "I'm learning," he said honestly, "about what it means to actually be present for him, not just physically there but emotionally available. About how to listen to what he's really saying instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. About how to put his needs ahead of my own comfort or convenience." "That's not easy," Mara said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just recognition of the genuine effort required to change fundamental patterns of behavior. "No, it's not, but it's necessary, and it's worth it to see him happy again." The changes in their household were subtle but significant. Elric had restructured his work schedule to be home for dinner every night, not just present in the same room, but actively engaged in conversation about Bram's day, his thoughts, his questions about the world around him. He had learned to put away his phone during family time, to give his son the focused attention that had once been reserved for business crises and investment opportunities. More importantly, he had begun to see parenting as something that required active skill development, rather than just natural instinct and good intentions. He read books about child development and emotional intelligence. He spoke with other parents about their experiences and challenges. He even started seeing a therapist to help him process his own childhood experiences and understand how they affected his ability to connect with Bram. "Children don't need perfect parents," Dr. Martinez had told him during one of their sessions. "They need parents who are willing to grow and change and acknowledge their mistakes. They need to see that adults can learn from errors and do better." The wisdom of that advice became clear during a conversation with Bram about the dinner party disaster. His son had been having nightmares about that evening, and Elric realized they needed to address what had happened directly rather than hoping Bram would simply forget about it. "Buddy," he said one night after a particularly restless bedtime, "I want to talk to you about that scary night when I got angry and hurt Mama Mara's feelings." Bram's eyes went wide, but he nodded seriously. "Okay, Daddy, what I did was wrong," Elric said simply. When grown-ups get angry, it's never okay to hurt other people, especially people who can't protect themselves. "I made a bad choice because I was embarrassed and scared, but that doesn't make it okay." "Are you going to do it again?" Bram asked, the question that had been haunting his dreams. "No," Elric said firmly. "I learned better ways to handle my feelings when I'm upset, and I promised myself that I would never hurt someone you love again, no matter how angry or scared I get." "What if you get really, really mad?" Bram pressed, needing reassurance that went beyond simple promises. "They'll take deep breaths, or go for a walk, or talk to my therapist about why I'm feeling that way. There are lots of ways to handle anger that don't involve hurting people." "Dr. Martinez helped you learn that?" "Yes, she did. And she's helping me learn how to be a better daddy, too." The conversation was difficult but necessary, and it marked a turning point in Bram's ability to trust that his world was safe and predictable again. Knowing that his father was actively working to be better, that there were systems in place to prevent future explosions of violence, allowed him to relax his vigilant monitoring of adult emotions and return to the natural curiosity and joy that were his birthright as a child. The piano lessons became the foundation for other shared activities. They started meeting at Central Park for weekend picnics, where Bram could play while the adults talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of friendship that transcended their original employer-employee relationship. They attended children's concerts together, visited museums, and even went on a camping trip to the Adirondacks, where Bram learned to identify different types of birds, and Elric learned that his son was far more capable and resilient than he had ever imagined. "Look, Daddy," Bram called out during one of their hiking expeditions, pointing to a hawk circling overhead. "Mama Mara taught me that hawks can see things that are really far away, but they have to be patient and wait for the right moment to act. Is that right?" Elric looked at Mara, who was helping Bram adjust his backpack straps with the efficient care that had always characterized her interactions with him. "I told him that sometimes the best things come to people who are willing to wait and watch and learn before making important decisions," she said with a small smile that suggested the lesson had applications beyond birdwatching. As autumn turned to winter, their unusual family structure began to feel less experimental and more established. Bram had piano lessons every Saturday, park visits every other Sunday, and occasional weekday dinners when Mara could join them at the penthouse. It wasn't traditional, and it certainly wasn't what any of them had planned when Mara first arrived to work as their nanny, but it was working in ways that none of them had expected. The real test came when Bram's school held its annual holiday concert, and he was selected to play a piano solo, a simple arrangement of Silent Night that he had been practicing with Mara for weeks. "Will you both come?" he asked anxiously. "I want both my daddy and Mama Mara to hear me play." Elric felt a momentary flicker of the old jealousy, the sense that his son's affections were divided in ways that diminished his own role. But looking at Bram's hopeful face, he realized that love wasn't a finite resource that had to be rationed or competed for. His son's love for Mara didn't reduce the love available for him any more than loving both of them made Bram's heart smaller or less capable. "Of course we'll both be there," he said. "We wouldn't miss it for anything." The night of the concert, sitting in the elementary school auditorium with Mara beside him, watching his son play a piece he had learned through patience and practice and the kind of encouragement that builds confidence rather than pressure, Elric felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The profound satisfaction of being part of something larger and more meaningful than his individual success. When Bram finished his performance and looked out into the audience, his face lighting up as he spotted both of them in the crowd, Elric understood that this was what family actually looked like. Not the perfect arrangements defined by law or blood or social convention, but the messy, complicated, chosen connections between people who committed to loving and supporting each other through whatever challenges life might present. After the concert, as they celebrated with ice cream and listened to Bram's excited recounting of every moment of his performance, Mara said something that crystallized everything they had learned about love and family and second chances. "You know, little one," she told Bram as he described how nervous he had been before starting to play, "the most beautiful music doesn't come from never making mistakes. It comes from learning how to recover when things don't go exactly as planned." Looking at his son's happy face, sticky with ice cream and bright with accomplishment, Elric realized that she was right about more than just music. The most beautiful families, the strongest relationships, the most meaningful love stories weren't the ones that never faced challenges or conflicts or mistakes. They were the ones that learned how to heal, how to forgive, how to grow stronger together instead of allowing difficulties to tear them apart. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Elric felt like he was building something worthy of her memory in Bram's future. 6 months had passed since the night that shattered everything. Spring had arrived in New York with hope and new beginnings, and Bram's 6th birthday provided the perfect opportunity to celebrate how far they had all come. Instead of elaborate parties with hired entertainment, they chose something simpler but infinitely more meaningful. A picnic in Central Park with the people who truly mattered. "Can we make the cake ourselves?" Bram had asked, and Elric no longer automatically deflected such requests. "What kind of cake?" "Chocolate with vanilla frosting. And I want to help mix everything and write happy birthday to me on top myself." So they spent Friday evening in their kitchen. Elric, Bram, and Mara, flour dusting every surface as they worked together to create something imperfect and wonderful. "Mara, why do cakes taste better when you make them with people you love?" Bram asked while they waited for it to bake. "What do you think?" she replied with her teaching smile. "I think maybe because when you cook with love, you put happiness into the food," Bram said seriously. "And happiness makes everything taste better." "That's exactly right," Elric said, marveling at his son's wisdom. The morning of the party dawned perfect and clear. Their small guest list reflected genuine relationships. 3 school friends, Mrs. Patterson from their building, Dr. Martinez, who had helped Elric become the father Bram deserved, and of course Mara, no longer an employee, but chosen family. As the children played games requiring nothing but imagination, and adults shared natural laughter on picnic blankets, Elric experienced pure joy, not about impressions, but about connection. When Bram opened Mara's gift, sheet music including a duet of "You Are My Sunshine," his face lit up with impossible brightness. "Can we play it now?" Mara pulled out a small portable keyboard. "I came prepared." What followed was the most beautiful performance any of them had witnessed. Not technically perfect, but infused with love. Bram concentrated on his part, while Mara provided harmony, their voices joining in familiar lyrics about sunshine and enduring love. "This is the best birthday ever," Bram announced when they finished. "Because everyone I love is here together, and we made music, and nobody has to leave early for work." That simple statement crystallized everything they'd learned about what mattered. Presence, attention, showing up for each other. As guests departed and they packed up their celebration, Bram asked, "Can we do this every year? Have my birthday in the park with all the people I love?" "Absolutely," Elric replied without hesitation. "Every year for as long as you want." Walking home through the park, Bram between them swinging their hands, Mara captured the essence of their journey. Families aren't just about blood or last names. They're about who shows up when you need them, who celebrates your successes, who helps through failures, and who loves you enough to keep choosing you every day. "Is that what we are?" Bram asked. "A family that chooses each other." "Yes," Elric said, the truth settling into his bones. "That's exactly what we are." That evening, Elric's phone buzzed with a message from camera, saw Mrs. Patterson's photos of Bram's party. He looked so happy. "Thank you for letting me be part of his story, even briefly. Wishing you all continued joy and healing." Attached was a photo from the duet performance. Bram and Mara at the keyboard, faces bright with joy, while Elric watched with pure love and pride. Looking at that image, Elric realized this was what success actually looked like. A child who felt loved and secure, relationships built on genuine care, and the knowledge that he had learned to be present for the people who mattered most. The most powerful apology he had discovered truly was change. Not grand gestures or eloquent speeches, but the daily choice to be better, to love better than the day before. And as he sat listening to his son sleeping peacefully upstairs, thinking about the woman who had taught them both what unconditional love looked like in practice, Elric understood that he had finally built something worthy of Sarah's memory and Bram's future. A family, chosen, imperfect, resilient, and real. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that love can heal even the deepest wounds, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button to let us know this message of hope and redemption resonated with you. And if you believe in the power of stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the transformative magic of unconditional love, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that will restore your faith in family, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Thank you for sharing this journey with Elric, Mara, and little Bram. Until our next story together, remember, it's never too late to become the person someone you love deserves.